Linköping, Sweden, a quiet town where nothing truly horrific ever happened until one autumn morning in 2004 when everything changed. The streets were still waking up. The air was crisp, tinged with the golden hues of fallen leaves, the sound of bicycle wheels clicking over cobblestone, the distant hum of a passing bus. Everything was as it should be, safe, normal, ordinary. But hidden within the stillness, something dark was about to unfold. Two strangers, unaware of what fate had in store for them, set out on their usual routes. Mohammed Ammouri, an 8-year-old boy full of life, was heading to school. A bright child, eager to learn, with a backpack slung over his tiny shoulders. His parents had sent him off that morning with a simple goodbye, never imagining it would be the last time they would see him alive. Anna-Lena Svensson, 56 years old, was walking to work. A kind-hearted woman, loved by her colleagues, someone who never made enemies. She wasn't supposed to be a target. They had never met before. Their lives had nothing in common. But in just a matter of minutes, their paths would cross with someone lurking in the shadows, a killer waiting for his moment to strike. What do you think it sounds like the moment horror begins? A whisper, a footstep, the sharp intake of breath before a scream. That morning, the first sign of terror came in the form of a chilling, piercing scream. It tore through the street, high-pitched, desperate, and suddenly cut short. A woman passing by stopped in her tracks, heart pounding. Her gaze darted toward the source of the sound, and what she saw would haunt her forever. Right there, on a street that was supposed to be safe, was a scene from a nightmare. Mohammed lay sprawled on the pavement, his small body motionless. His backpack had been thrown aside, its contents spilling onto the ground, a notebook, a pencil case, a few crayons. A child's world shattered in an instant. Just a few steps away, Anna-Lena Svensson was still standing, but barely. Blood seeped through her coat as she struggled to remain on her feet. Her attacker was right in front of her, a man with a knife, his expression unreadable. She tried to fight. She tried to run. But then a final, devastating blow. And then silence. The attacker didn't linger. He didn't check to see if they were alive. He simply vanished, gone as if he had never been there, leaving behind only death and confusion. How? How could someone commit such a savage act and then disappear into thin air? And more importantly, why? At first, no one had answers. All they knew was this. A young boy and a woman had just been brutally murdered in broad daylight, and no one had seen the killer coming. The sound of sirens broke the morning quiet as paramedics and police rushed to the scene. They worked frantically, checking pulses, shouting instructions, trying to reverse the irreversible. But it was too late. Mohammed Ammouri was gone. A child who had been full of life just minutes earlier, now lifeless, his small body lying in the street. Anna-Lena Svensson didn't survive either. A woman who had been simply walking to work, who had done nothing wrong, was now another victim of this senseless, brutal crime. The police cordoned off the area. Journalists arrived, cameras flashing. The streets, once so ordinary, had turned into the center of Sweden's most baffling and horrifying crime. The community was in shock. How could this happen here, in broad daylight? Was it a personal attack, a random act of violence, a serial killer at large? Was the murderer still watching from the shadows? And yet, there were no immediate answers, no suspect, no clear motive, just blood on the pavement and 2 lives stolen. But then a glimmer of hope. The forensic team did find something, a crucial clue, a mistake. A single oversight by the killer, one that, years later, would become his undoing. DNA. It was there, on the knife, on the victims, undeniable proof of the killer's identity. So why wasn't the case solved immediately? Because in 2004, DNA databases were limited. The sample didn't match anyone in Sweden's system, which meant no name, no arrest, no justice, not yet. Because 16 years later, this tiny clue would bring everything crashing down for the man who thought he had gotten away with murder. At first glance, the crime scene was eerily clean. No discarded weapon, no footprints leading away, no CCTV cameras capturing a fleeing suspect. It was almost as if the killer had vanished into thin air. But even the most careful murderer makes mistakes. And this one, he left behind something that could never be erased: DNA. It was found on the victims. It was on the murder weapon, a knife that had been left behind at the scene. It was undeniable evidence, a genetic fingerprint that could expose the killer's identity. So why wasn't the case solved immediately? Because in 2004, forensic science was powerful but limited. DNA testing existed, but databases weren't as advanced as they are today. Sweden's criminal DNA registry was small, and this DNA, it wasn't in the system. Whoever had committed these murders had never been arrested before, which meant no match, no name, no arrest. The only real piece of evidence police had the key to unlocking the case was useless at the time. And the killer, he walked away, free, untouched, a ghost in the system. Years passed, and with every year, the weight of unanswered questions grew heavier. Who was he? Where was he? Had he killed again? Detectives ran the DNA through Sweden's database again and again, every time hoping for a match, every time coming up empty-handed. The crime, at first a national shock, began to fade from headlines. But for Mohammed's family, Anna-Lena's loved ones, the pain never faded. And the worst part, the killer was out there, somewhere, living a normal life, a murderer hiding in plain sight. Was this random? If it was, then the man responsible could snap again. If it wasn't, then who was the real target? Was Linköping dealing with a serial killer? No one knew. And the DNA, the only real lead, just sat in a file, waiting for technology to catch up with the truth. And in 2020, it finally did. It started with a new technique, something that had never been used in Sweden before: forensic genealogy. Have you heard of it? It's the same method used to catch one of America's most infamous criminals, the Golden State Killer. But what makes forensic genealogy so powerful? Here's how it works. Instead of searching for a direct DNA match in criminal databases, forensic genealogy traces a family tree. The process finds distant relatives, people who share partial DNA with the unknown suspect. From there, it works backward, narrowing the search until only one person fits. And in Linköping, that's exactly what happened. 16 years after the murders, investigators ran the DNA one more time. But this time, they weren't just looking for a match. They were looking for bloodlines. And within months, they had something. Not a name, not yet, but a family. The DNA didn't belong to any known criminal, but it belonged to someone related to him. And with that one clue, detectives were closer than ever before, closer than the killer ever thought they would be. The case had been cold for 16 years. The DNA had been there all along, waiting, untouched, like a silent witness. But now, for the first time, it spoke. Swedish investigators sent the long-preserved DNA sample to genealogical experts, a move that would change everything. How does this work? It wasn't about finding an exact match in criminal records anymore. It was about finding blood connections. And that's exactly what happened. The results came back, and at first, no suspect, no direct match, but relatives, distant family members spread across Sweden, people who had nothing to do with the crime but carried traces of the same DNA. None of them were criminals. None of them had ever been in trouble with the law. But hidden somewhere in their family tree was a killer, someone linked by blood to this horrific crime. Now it was just a matter of tracking down the right branch, and once they did, there would be nowhere left to hide. Piece by piece, detectives worked their way through the complex web of distant relatives. It was meticulous work eliminating innocent family members, tracing each connection, moving one step closer to the truth, until finally only one name remained: Daniel Nyqvist. And suddenly everything fell into place. But here's the shocking part: no one had ever suspected him. No criminal history, no violent past, no known connection to either of the victims. So how? Why him? To the outside world, he was just an ordinary man. But the DNA, it didn't lie. Investigators obtained a fresh sample, this time directly from Nyqvist himself. And when they ran it against the 16-year-old DNA sample from the crime scene, a perfect match. It was over. The ghost who had haunted this case for 16 years finally had a name. Now the police just had to find him. Imagine this. For 16 years, a murderer had lived a normal life. He walked among people who had no idea what he had done. He was never questioned, never suspected. But now, the past was about to catch up to him. On June 9th, 2020, Swedish police arrived at Daniel Nyqvist's home. It wasn't a high-speed chase. There was no dramatic standoff. They knocked. He opened the door. And when they told him why they were there, he didn't run. He didn't deny it. He didn't resist. He simply said, "Yes, it was me." Just like that. 16 years of mystery solved in an instant. But there was still one haunting question left unanswered. Why? Now that the mystery of his identity was solved, another question loomed over the investigation: who was Daniel Nyqvist? Why would a man with no criminal history, no known violent tendencies, and no connection to the victims commit such a brutal, senseless crime? The answer: it was even more disturbing than anyone expected. Daniel Nyqvist was a nobody. A man who had lived most of his life invisible to the outside world. No close friends, no significant relationships, no social life. A loner, isolated from society, slipping through the cracks but never raising suspicion. He had no job, no history of serious criminal behavior. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet man living his life. But inside his mind, something wasn't right. Reports would later reveal that Nyqvist had struggled with severe mental health issues for years. Psychiatrists would determine that he suffered from paranoid delusions and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. But here's the chilling part. This wasn't an impulsive crime. It was planned. He had wanted to kill someone. Not Mohammed, not Anna-Lena. Just someone, anyone. There was no personal motive, no revenge, no history with the victims. He woke up that morning, left his home, and chose two strangers at random. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Think about it. How do you stop a killer like this? There were no warning signs, no threats, no troubled past filled with violence. He simply decided to end lives, and he did. And that's what makes this case so terrifying. Because how many more people like him exist hiding in plain sight? And how many have gotten away with it? The arrest of Daniel Nyqvist sent shockwaves across Sweden. The case had haunted Linköping for 16 years, and now the man responsible for the random, senseless killings of Mohammed Ammouri and Anna-Lena Svensson had finally been unmasked. But even with his confession, one lingering question refused to go away. Why? There was no logical reason, no personal vendetta, no history of violence, just a man who had decided, for no reason at all, to kill. And that realization was what made this case truly horrifying. When investigators confronted Nyqvist with the evidence, they didn't expect what happened next. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't try to shift the blame. Instead, he admitted to everything calmly, emotionlessly, as if he were confessing to stealing a loaf of bread rather than murdering two innocent people in broad daylight. And then he said something that sent a chill down the detectives' spines. "I've wanted to kill someone for a long time." It was that simple, not revenge, not rage, just a desire to kill. This wasn't an act of passion. It wasn't premeditated in the sense of choosing a target, but it had been planned in his mind for a long time. He had gone outside that morning intending to take a life. Who it was, that didn't matter to him. And that's what made him so dangerous. Because how do you predict or stop a killer who has no pattern? News of Nyqvist's arrest spread like wildfire. People weren't just shocked, they were angry. How could someone like him go unnoticed for so long? In the aftermath, journalists dug into his past. They found that Nyqvist had suffered from mental illness for years, but he had never been considered a threat to society. He had no prior arrests, no history of violence. There had been red flags, but nothing severe enough to suggest he was capable of murdering two strangers in the street. And that raised an unsettling question. How many more people like him were out there? People walking among us, seemingly ordinary but harboring thoughts of random violence. It was a terrifying reality. With a full confession and DNA evidence linking him to the crime, there was no doubt Nyqvist was the killer. But here's where the case took another turn. Instead of standing trial for murder, he was declared mentally unfit. A court-appointed psychiatric evaluation determined that Nyqvist suffered from severe schizophrenia and paranoid delusions. He was sentenced to indefinite psychiatric care instead of prison. For some, this felt like a loophole, as if he was escaping true justice. But was there any other option? Could he really be held accountable for something he did while in the grip of a severe mental disorder? It's a debate that still lingers today. If forensic genealogy hadn't been used, would this case have ever been solved? The answer, probably not. Traditional DNA searches had led nowhere for 16 years. Nyqvist wasn't in any criminal database. But forensic genealogy didn't rely on his DNA alone. It used his relatives' DNA building a family tree until it pointed straight to him. This case proved that forensic genealogy wasn't just a powerful tool, it was a necessity for solving cold cases. And Sweden took notice. For 16 years, Mohammed Ammouri's family and Anna-Lena Svensson's loved ones had lived with painful uncertainty. The lack of answers had left an open wound that refused to heal. Now they had closure, but was it enough? The families spoke publicly about the case, expressing relief that the killer had finally been caught, but also frustration that it had taken this long. If forensic genealogy had been available sooner, could their suffering have been cut short? The thought was devastating. This case proved that DNA isn't just evidence, it's a time capsule. For 16 years, Nyqvist's DNA sat in storage waiting. It was undeniable proof of his guilt, yet completely useless until science caught up. How many more cases are like this? How many unsolved murders, rapes, disappearances have DNA waiting to be unlocked? It's a chilling thought. Because as technology improves, killers who think they've escaped justice may soon be in for a rude awakening. After this case, Sweden changed its approach to cold cases. Forensic genealogy became a priority not just in Sweden, but around the world. Investigators reopened cases that had been gathering dust for decades. And across the globe, forensic genealogy led to the capture of killers who had evaded justice for years. It was no longer a theory, it was a revolution in crime solving. Here's a terrifying thought. Was this really his first crime? Daniel Nyqvist was never suspected of anything else. But when a killer shows no remorse and randomly picks victims, you have to ask, had he done it before? Or had he planned to do it again? It's impossible to know. But one thing is certain, if forensic genealogy hadn't caught him, he would have remained a free man. And that's a reality too disturbing to think about. This case proves something chilling yet hopeful. No matter how much time passes, evidence doesn't forget. 16 years later, DNA solved a crime that had seemed unsolvable. So what does this mean for the future? It means that killers who think they've escaped justice should be afraid, because time doesn't erase evidence. Technology only gets better. And even in the darkest, coldest cases, the truth always finds a way to come to light. Final thoughts. What do you think about this case? Should forensic genealogy be used in all cold cases? Was justice truly served? How many more cases like this are waiting to be solved? One thing is clear, this case was proof that no matter how much time passes, science will always catch up. And for those hiding in the shadows, their time is running out. The case of Daniel Nyqvist is terrifying for one simple reason: it was random. There was no personal vendetta, no deep-seated grudge, no connection between the victims and their killer. Just a man who decided, for no reason at all, that it was time to end two innocent lives. And that raises a chilling question. How many more killers like him are out there? How many cold cases sit in police archives waiting for DNA to tell their story? How many hidden murderers believe they got away with it, never realizing that science is closing in on them? How many more families are still waiting for justice? With forensic genealogy, the rules have changed. Old cases are being reopened. Cold trails are suddenly warming up. But the real question is, who will be caught next? Because if history has shown us anything, it's that the truth always finds a way out. And for those still hiding in the shadows, their time is running out. What do you think about this case? Was justice served? Should forensic genealogy be used in all cold cases? How many more killers could be walking free right now? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more chilling true crime stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this isn't just a story, it's real. And the next case, it could be unfolding right now. Stay curious, stay cautious, and we'll see you in the next one.